17 minutes. That is how long it took NASCAR to bring two grown men into a hauler and get one very strange confession out of it. Shane Van Gisbergen walked out first. He said one word, interesting. Then Austin Hill walked out. And what he apparently told Van Gisbergen behind that closed door is the reason this story is blowing up today. He said he was going to get the last laugh. The spotter sees everything, and today we are breaking down what actually happened inside NASCAR's hauler and why this rivalry is nowhere close to finished. Let's set the scene. This past Saturday, hours before qualifying for the Quaker State 400 at EchoPark Speedway, NASCAR officials called both Shane Van Gisbergen and Austin Hill into the hauler, not for a penalty. NASCAR had already decided days earlier that neither driver would be penalized for what happened at Chicagoland. This meeting was something else entirely, a closed-door conversation designed to stop something before it happens again. Van Gisbergen emerged first. Reporters asked him how it went. He said, and I am quoting directly, it's interesting, that is it. That is all he gave them in the moment. Then Austin Hill walked out. And Hill, unlike Van Gisbergen, actually talked. He confirmed there had been a real conversation inside that hauler. He said, NASCAR, let them know what they need to do going forward. And when a reporter asked if things were finally settled between them, Hill did not say yes. He said, I sure hope so. Read that answer again. Not it is settled. I sure hope so. That is not the response of two men who walked out of a room with a resolved rivalry. Now here is the detail that turned this story from a quiet procedural meeting into something people are still talking about today. In a separate interview after the meeting, Van Gisbergen revealed exactly what Hill told him behind that closed door. He said Hill threatened to get the last laugh. Think about that phrase for a second. Not an apology, not a truce, a threat delivered inside a meeting that NASCAR specifically organized to calm things down. Van Gisbergen did not sugarcoat how he felt about that exchange. He said it plainly. Whenever he has a problem with someone in that garage, he can usually talk it out and move on quickly. But with Hill, he said, it never works that way. He said Hill backs up and resorts to threatening violence. That is a direct quote from a Cup Series driver on the record this week. Not hard racing, not a heated exchange, threatening violence. Now let's rewind and understand exactly why these two drivers ended up in that hauler in the first place. Last Sunday at Chicagoland Speedway, on lap 47, Van Gisbergen's number 97 Chevrolet made contact with the rear of Hill's number 33 car exiting turn 3. Hill's car snapped into the outside wall. His race ended on the spot. Before his damaged car even reached the garage, Hill retaliated. He sideswiped Van Gisbergen's car under caution, despite his own team begging him over the radio not to do it. NASCAR reviewed throttle data, steering data, radio transmissions, and camera angles from every lap. Both drivers ran, and they still could not find enough evidence to call either incident 100% intentional. So they did something unusual. No penalty. But a mandatory meeting anyway. NASCAR's own Vice President of Racing Communications explained the logic publicly. He said there was nothing definitive proving the contact was penalty worthy, but he also said there are, in his words, hot heads with these two folks, and NASCAR wanted a conversation before it boiled over into something bigger at Atlanta or beyond. There is a detail buried in the timeline here that most fans missed. NASCAR's Senior Vice President of Competition, Elton Sawyer, personally spoke with Hill the Monday before this weekend's meeting, a full day before NASCAR even made the hauler meeting public. That means NASCAR was already working this situation privately behind the scenes before they ever announced anything to the media. And this is not the first time Hill's name has come up in a conversation about aggressive driving. He has been fined before for on-track incidents in the lower series, which is exactly why some fans have started questioning whether he even belongs in a Cup Series seat, full stop, regardless of how the specific rivalry resolves. That meeting is the one Van Gisbergen and Hill just walked out of, and based on what came out of it, the boiling over might not be prevented at all. It might just be delayed. Now here is where this story gets its real depth, because this is not a rivalry that started at Chicagoland. This is not even a rivalry that started this season. Van Gisbergen and Hill first collided back in March of 2024, trading paint at Circuit of the Americas while both were racing full-time in what was then the Xfinity Series. A few months later at Sonoma, the two were battling for the lead on a restart. Van Gisbergen sent Hill sliding off the racing surface and went on to win the race. As Van Gisbergen celebrated with his signature victory burnout, Hill drove past him and gave him the middle finger. On live television during a celebration lap, Van Gisbergen later admitted that moment changed everything for him. He said it turned his celebratory burnout into something personal, no longer for the fans, but specifically aimed back at Hill. Fast forward to this year's Cup Series season, and the pattern repeated itself with alarming speed. June, Pocono Raceway. Hill made the track 3 wide exiting turn 3, collecting several cars including Van Gisbergen in the chain reaction. 1 week later, at the street race in San Diego, Hill slid into his own teammate Connor Zilisch, entering a fast corner, sending both cars into the fence and collecting Van Gisbergen again, ending his day as the race favorite. 2 incidents 2 weeks in a row. Van Gisbergen himself said afterward that he had now been wrecked by, in his words, the same spud 2 weeks running. And then Chicagoland happened, which brings us to this weekend and the meeting that was supposed to fix all of it. Here is what makes this entire situation genuinely fascinating heading into tonight's race. Van Gisbergen and Hill are not just rivals with bad history, they are 2 drivers with wildly different stakes in what happens next. Van Gisbergen enters tonight's race sitting 14th in the NASCAR Cup Series points standings, fighting to hold on to a spot inside the chase cut line with only 7 regular season races remaining. He said it himself plainly this week. He is the one with a lot to lose. Hill, meanwhile, only races the Cup Series part-time. His full-time commitment is to the NASCAR Riley Auto Parts Series with Richard Childress Racing. He took over the number 33 Cup car this season under emotionally difficult circumstances, stepping into the seat following the death of 2-time champion Kyle Busch. Hill does not need Cup Series points to build a championship campaign. He does not carry the same risk that Van Gisbergen carries every single lap. And that imbalance is exactly what Van Gisbergen pointed to when he explained why he feels so uneasy about this rivalry going forward. If one driver has everything to lose and the other has almost nothing to lose, the incentives on the racetrack are not equal. And here is one more detail worth noting. Van Gisbergen and Hill were not the only drivers called to a NASCAR hauler this week. Zane Smith and Carson Hocevar were reportedly summoned for a separate meeting of their own over an entirely different on-track dispute, which tells you something about where NASCAR's patience currently sits across the entire garage this season. Multiple simmering rivalries, multiple private conversations, and a governing body clearly trying to manage tempers before the intensity of the chase makes everything worse. Tonight, Van Gisbergen and Hill line up next to each other again. Van Gisbergen starts 12th. Hill starts 30th. On a track that drafts like a superspeedway where cars run in tight packs at nearly 200 miles an hour, where one aggressive move can end multiple championship campaigns in an instant. The spotter sees everything here is my take. NASCAR's decision not to penalize either driver and then to summon them for a private conversation instead was meant to be a preventative measure, a way of saying, we see this building and we want to stop it before someone gets hurt or a championship gets wrecked. But what actually happened inside that hauler, based on Van Gisbergen's own account, sounds less like resolution and more like an escalation with better manners. A threat to get the last laugh is not the language of a rivalry winding down. It is the language of a rivalry that has simply moved from the racetrack into a private room and back out again with the same tension fully intact. Van Gisbergen has the most to lose tonight, he said so himself. And if Hill genuinely believes he is owed one more shot at getting the last laugh, the next collision between these 2 cars might not wait for a hauler meeting afterward. It might end someone's chase hopes on the spot. So here is my question for you. Does tonight's race at Atlanta finally settle this rivalry, or does it get significantly worse before it gets better? Drop your prediction in the comments right now. If this one hit, give it a like and subscribe. The spotter will be back with the full breakdown the moment the checkered flag falls at EchoPark Speedway tonight.